On January 5, 1942, the city of Tokyo was roaring with the sound of triumph. Cheers echoed through the streets, flags waved in every direction, and the Empire of Japan stood at what many believed to be the height of its power. Across Asia, Japanese forces were winning everywhere, in Malaya, in the Philippines, in Hong Kong. To the public, Japan looked unstoppable. But inside a quiet office aboard the Imperial Navy's flagship, a man named Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in deep thought. While others celebrated, he was worried. If you love discovering the secret decisions, untold fears, and bold strategies that shaped World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Because stories like this one will change the way you see history forever. And while you're at it, tell us in the comments, from where in the world are you watching? Let's see how far history travels today. Now, back to that cold January morning. Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet, had just ordered his staff to begin planning the second phase of Japan's war in the Pacific. The first stage, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the capture of Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, had gone far better than anyone expected. In less than a month, the empire had expanded further than in decades of previous wars. But Yamamoto, calm and calculating, knew something the others didn't want to admit. Victories like these never lasted forever. He looked over reports from across Asia, lists of captured territories, charts of advancing armies, and quietly told his chief of staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, to prepare the next plan by mid-February. It wasn't celebration in his tone, but urgency. Yamamoto could already see beyond the headlines of victory. He saw a problem growing on the horizon. While the Japanese military high command was swept up in euphoria, Tokyo's inner circles were divided. One faction, the fiery nationalists, wanted to press forward endlessly. Their logic was simple: Japan was winning, so why stop? Push deeper into Asia, strike the British Empire, crush any resistance. The other side, led by Yamamoto, was more cautious. They believed Japan was walking a dangerous path. Yamamoto had never wanted war with the United States or Britain in the first place. He knew exactly what kind of industrial power those nations possessed, and that in a long war, Japan could never win. He wasn't just guessing. Yamamoto had lived in America for years. He'd studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and seen with his own eyes the massive shipyards, oil fields, and factories that stretched from coast to coast. He knew the American strength wasn't in spirit or strategy, it was in industry, and that was something Japan could never match. Still, his warnings had made him enemies, so many, in fact, that Yamamoto's closest allies feared for his life. That's why he wasn't in Tokyo when the war began. They'd quietly stationed him at sea aboard the giant battleship Yamato, where assassins couldn't reach him. Some officers in the army despised him for his cautious nature. Others whispered that he lacked faith in Japan's destiny. But to those who knew him, his doubts weren't cowardice. They were realism. Ugaki, his chief of staff, wrote in his diary about their conversations. The need, as Yamamoto said, for far-sighted statesmanship even in the glow of victory. Yamamoto warned that these early wins, as glorious as they seemed, were a trap. Japan could conquer half the Pacific, he said. But if they didn't find peace within 2 years, they'd face disaster. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with an old friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, a powerful nationalist leader, at the Imperial Navy Club in Tokyo. Over tea, Yamamoto told him that war with the United States was already unavoidable. But he also predicted exactly how it would go. At first, he said, we will have everything our own way. We will stretch across the Pacific like an octopus spreading its tentacles, but soon after, we will be flattened. And he was right. Still, in early 1942, that flattening was hard to imagine. The Japanese Navy had destroyed the U.S. battleships at Pearl Harbor, sunk the British Prince of Wales and Repulse, and captured key bases across Asia. Tokyo was glowing with confidence. The newspapers were filled with headlines declaring a new order in East Asia, but Yamamoto saw the danger in that confidence. He knew the attack on Pearl Harbor, though spectacular, had failed in one crucial way. America's aircraft carriers had escaped. Those carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, but were now ghosts haunting his dreams. They were the weapons that could strike back. To truly secure Japan's victory, Yamamoto needed one more blow, one that would crush American morale completely, the Problem was deciding where to strike. The Japanese army wanted to push deeper into Asia. Some officers argued they should attack the Soviet Union, but Yamamoto refused. The army was already stretched thin in China and Southeast Asia. Fighting Russia would be suicide. Others proposed an invasion of Australia, cutting off the Americans from their southern supply routes. The idea sounded bold, but Yamamoto dismissed it. Australia was too big and too costly to invade. What he wanted was something dramatic. A single strike so devastating that it would force the Americans to the peace table. So he turned his eyes to the ocean. Yamamoto believed Japan's best chance lay in drawing the American fleet into a trap, a massive sea battle where the Imperial Navy could destroy what remained of U.S. naval power. If he could wipe out the American carriers, the Pacific would be his. From there, Japan could negotiate peace from a position of strength. His plan was daring and dangerous. He wanted to attack Midway, a small island halfway between Hawaii and Japan. If Japan could lure the Americans there and destroy their carriers, he believed the U.S. would have no choice but to surrender or negotiate. But Yamamoto didn't stop there. He also proposed a second plan, codenamed AL, to invade Alaska's Aleutian Islands, potentially giving Japan a foothold on North American soil. To his mind, victories at both Midway and Alaska would shock the world. And with Hawaii threatened, Japan could offer peace terms that the West might actually accept. When Yamamoto's staff presented the MI plan, the attack on Midway, Tokyo's admirals argued endlessly over it. Some believed it was too risky. Others said Japan should focus on consolidating its new empire instead of chasing another big victory. But Yamamoto, known for his sharp mind and absolute confidence, refused to back down. Finally, he got his way. Ironically, while Japan prepared for Midway, they ignored another moment that might have brought them the same success: the fall of Singapore in February 1942. That British defeat had shaken the Allied world, but it didn't satisfy Yamamoto. He wanted something even bigger, something that would make the Americans kneel. Then in April, something happened that changed everything. A squadron of 16 American B-25 bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, launched from the deck of the carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo. Though the damage was minimal, the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, the Japanese capital had been hit. The Doolittle Raid shocked the imperial leadership and humiliated them. Yamamoto realized immediately that this was exactly what he had feared: proof that the Americans were not broken, but awakening. The Doolittle Raid convinced Tokyo that America's carriers had to be destroyed at all costs. The time for Midway had come. Yamamoto's plan was massive: more than 200 ships and 250 aircraft. 4 of Japan's elite carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike Midway Island, supported by battleships, cruisers, and submarines. The goal was to lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into battle and annihilate it. Yamamoto called it Operation MI, but he didn't know that the Americans had already broken Japan's naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew the attack was coming. And where? When Japan struck Midway in June, the U.S. was waiting. The result was a catastrophe. In just one day, all 4 of Japan's frontline carriers were sunk. Over 250 aircraft and their most experienced pilots were lost. It was a disaster so great that Tokyo kept it secret even from its own army. Few outside the Naval High Command knew what had really happened. While Yamamoto reeled from the defeat, the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo turned its attention elsewhere. To the south, toward Australia and the Solomon Islands. They refused to give up their dream of isolating Australia. Japan's Navy had already captured the vital base of Rabaul in January and was using it as a launch point for further expansion. Now they began constructing airfields in New Guinea, moving closer to Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur, newly arrived in Australia, could see what was coming. He knew that if Japan secured New Guinea, Northern Australia would be next. He warned Washington that a massive attack could come at any time, and begged for reinforcements, 2 carriers and 1,000 planes. But the U.S. Navy had just fought Midway. Its resources were stretched thin. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, told MacArthur bluntly that he could spare only 2 carriers for the entire Pacific, while Japan still had 10. As the Japanese moved toward Port Moresby and Tulagi, the first major carrier clash of history took place, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Though both sides suffered losses, Japan's advance was halted. For the first time, their expansion had been stopped. Yamamoto, though frustrated, didn't change course. Even after the Midway disaster, Japan's high command continued with their plans to cut off Australia. They believed the Americans wouldn't recover quickly enough to interfere, but they were wrong again. By mid-1942, a new kind of war was brewing in the South Pacific, one that would be fought island by island through jungles, coral reefs, and seas filled with blood. And at the heart of it all was a name that would soon become legendary: Guadalcanal. After the disaster at Midway, the Imperial Navy was wounded but not broken. In the shadows of their defeat, Japanese strategists clung to the belief that they could still turn the tide. If they couldn't destroy the American fleet, then perhaps they could isolate Australia and choke off the Allies' supply lines. That would leave the Americans stranded, and maybe force them to negotiate peace. From the fortified base at Rabaul on New Britain, Japanese aircraft scouted far across the South Pacific, searching for new footholds. They saw opportunity in a chain of islands few Americans could find on a map: the Solomons. On a humid day in May 1942, Japanese troops landed on Tulagi and began constructing a seaplane base. It was small, remote, and insignificant, or so it seemed. But Yamamoto's planners had a grand vision. From Tulagi, they would expand south to Guadalcanal, a jungle-covered island with a flat, open plain that seemed perfect for an airfield. Once complete, that runway could launch attacks deep into the Pacific, threatening Allied convoys between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. To the Allies, this was unacceptable. If Japan finished that airfield, the war in the Pacific could be lost before it truly began. In Washington, General George Marshall and Admiral Ernest King argued over what to do. King, stubborn and sharp, believed in striking back immediately, even with limited resources. MacArthur, on the other hand, wanted to prepare more thoroughly to strike with overwhelming force from Australia. But time was running out. By early July, intelligence reports painted a worrying picture. Japanese engineers, known as the 11th and 13th Pioneer Units, were already on Guadalcanal, clearing jungle and laying out the first strips of coral runway. Australian coast watchers hidden in the jungle sent word to Allied headquarters. The airfield was nearly ready. Within weeks, Japanese bombers could dominate the entire region. That was the spark. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America would go on the offensive. The plan was hurried, rough, and risky, but it was bold. The target: Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and nearby islands. The goal: seize the airfield before it became operational. The operation was codenamed Watchtower. The plan came together in chaos. Many officers had no time to train their men for amphibious warfare. In fact, the U.S. military hadn't launched a large-scale amphibious landing since the Spanish-American War, over 40 years earlier. Most of the soldiers and Marines had never even seen combat. But orders were orders. Admiral Ernest King, the Navy's chief, knew the operation was desperate, yet absolutely necessary. "If we don't stop them here," he said, "they'll be bombing Australia within months." In late July 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered the Pacific Fleet into motion. Hundreds of ships began assembling in secret, stretching from Pearl Harbor to New Zealand. At their center were the 3 remaining American carriers: Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp. They would provide air cover for the invasion, but even their combined power was fragile compared to Japan's vast air fleets at Rabaul. As the invasion fleet gathered at the Fijian island of Koro for final rehearsals, the scene was anything but confidence-inspiring. The mock landings went disastrously. Landing craft ran aground, supplies were misplaced, and radio communication broke down completely. General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, called it a complete fiasco. But there was no time to fix mistakes. The invasion date was set for August 7, 1942. Among the sailors and Marines aboard the ships, rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed they were heading for New Guinea. Others thought they were attacking Rabaul itself. Few had even heard of Guadalcanal. They studied their maps by flashlight, staring at a tiny speck in the Pacific and wondering what waited there. Then came a strange twist of fate: the weather. As the massive armada of 75 ships steamed toward the Solomons, heavy rain squalls and thick clouds rolled in. For 2 days they sailed unseen. Japanese patrol planes flew their regular routes, but the Americans slipped through undetected. It was as if nature itself had cloaked them. When dawn broke on August 7th, the clouds lifted. The jungle coastline of Guadalcanal appeared on the horizon, lush green against the deep blue sea. For the young Marines staring from the decks, it was a surreal sight. This was it, America's first offensive of World War II. At 6 a.m., the silence shattered from the carriers, Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise. Waves of aircraft roared into the sky. Dive bombers and fighters streaked toward Tulagi and Guadalcanal, dropping their first bombs on Japanese positions. Within minutes, fuel dumps exploded, seaplanes burned in the water, and chaos erupted across the Japanese outposts. The surprise was total. On Guadalcanal itself, the Japanese construction crews were caught completely off guard. Most were laborers, not soldiers. They dropped their tools and ran for the jungle as explosions ripped through their camp. Their breakfast fires were still burning when the Marines came ashore. Plates of rice and fish were left on tables. Hammocks swung empty in the breeze. At 9 a.m., the first American troops waded through the surf onto the beaches near Lunga Point. They met almost no resistance. After months of defeat and retreat, American forces were finally taking ground from the Japanese, and it felt easy. Too easy. On nearby Tulagi, however, it was a different story. There, the Japanese defenders and around 250 men from the Yokohama Air Group were veterans, disciplined and determined to fight to the death. When Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, and his 1st Marine Raider Battalion stormed the island, they found the jungle dense, the terrain brutal, and the enemy invisible. From hidden caves and camouflaged bunkers, Japanese machine guns opened fire, cutting down the first waves. By nightfall, the Marines had taken half the island. The other half burned under flares and tracer rounds. Then came the first taste of what would become the Pacific War's most chilling signature, the Banzai attack. At 10:30 that night, as the Marines tried to rest, the jungle erupted. Screaming soldiers charged through the darkness, their bayonets flashing. The Japanese broke through the American line, surrounding one company completely. What followed was pure chaos. Hand-to-hand combat, grenades exploding at point-blank range, men fighting with knives and rifle butts. When dawn came, the Marines were shaken but victorious. Nearly every Japanese soldier on Tulagi was dead. The next day, Edson's men advanced, clearing out the last resistance. They discovered Japanese officers who had committed suicide rather than surrender, their pistols still in their hands. Others had blown themselves up with grenades. To the Americans, it was shocking. The first real glimpse of the enemy's fanatic resolve. Across the narrow strait, on tiny Gavutu and Tanambogo Islands, the battle was even worse. The Japanese had fortified the seaplane base there, turning every hill and bunker into a fortress. When the Marines landed, they were met with a wall of fire. Entire waves were pinned down on the beach. One American tank, its crew fighting desperately, was swarmed by Japanese soldiers who pried open the hatches and stabbed the commander to death. Others jammed crowbars under the treads, threw grenades, and set it ablaze with rags soaked in gasoline. The fighting lasted 2 days. Out of 500 Japanese defenders, none survived. On Guadalcanal itself, things seemed calm. The Marines pushed inland, expecting a fight that never came. By August 8th, they reached the half-finished airfield, a flat stretch of coral and grass that the Japanese had nearly completed. The Americans seized it easily, renaming it Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. They didn't know it yet. But this airfield would become the most fought-over piece of ground in the entire Pacific. For now, morale was high. Marines joked, smoked, and dug foxholes under the tropical sun. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one said. But the officers weren't laughing. They knew it was too quiet. At sea, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force, was getting nervous. He'd promised only 2 days of air cover for the invasion before pulling back to refuel. Many officers, including Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who led the amphibious force, begged him to stay. But Fletcher, still haunted by past losses, was cautious to the point of fear. On the evening of August 8th, he sent word. The carriers were leaving. The invasion force, tens of thousands of men and dozens of ships, was now alone. What no one realized was that the Japanese Navy was already on its way. Far to the north, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding the Japanese 8th Fleet, had gathered a powerful strike force, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. When he received news of the American landings, he moved swiftly, determined to strike that very night. His ships thundered south through a narrow channel between the islands and a dark, winding corridor that Allied sailors would soon call the Slot. The Americans had no idea they were coming. It was the perfect setup for disaster. The night of August 8, 1942 was calm. Too calm. Over the black waters of Iron Bottom Sound, the American invasion fleet sat still, its ships anchored in neat formation, their lights dimmed, their crews exhausted after 2 days of unrelenting operations. Most of the sailors believed the worst was over. They had landed the Marines, captured the airfield, and faced only a few scattered air attacks. Many went to bed thinking victory was secure, but in the darkness beyond the horizon, Japan's revenge was already racing toward them. Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's fleet, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a single destroyer, was slicing south through the Slot at top speed. The moon was hidden behind clouds, the sea calm, and every Japanese sailor aboard those ships knew the mission: strike fast, strike hard, and destroy everything in the bay before dawn. Mikawa's plan was simple. The Americans had carriers nearby, but at night they would be useless. The Japanese excelled in night combat. They trained for it, lived for it. Their ships carried deadly long-range torpedoes. The fearsome Type 93 Long Lance, capable of hitting targets over 20 miles away. At midnight, Mikawa's lookout spotted the first faint glow of the Allied fleet anchored near Savo Island. The Americans were unaware. Their radar, still primitive, failed to detect the incoming ships. The few patrol planes that might have seen them were grounded for the night, and the Coast Watcher's warnings never reached Admiral Turner in time. It was the perfect storm of complacency and chaos. At 1:30 a.m., Mikawa gave the order. Within moments, the dark sea exploded with fire. Japanese searchlights swept across the waves, illuminating rows of sleeping American cruisers and destroyers. Then came the torpedoes, dozens of them streaking through the water like glowing serpents. Seconds later, the first blasts tore through the night. The Australian cruiser, HMS Canberra, was hit first. A massive explosion ripped through her side, igniting fuel and ammunition. The ship erupted in flames as men scrambled for lifeboats or jumped into the sea. Nearby, the American cruiser USS Chicago was struck, her bow torn apart. The surprise was total. Sailors stumbled from their bunks, blinded by firelight and smoke, not knowing where the enemy was or which way to shoot. Japanese shells screamed across the water, smashing into Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria. 3 American cruisers caught helplessly in the middle of the formation. In minutes, the scene became hell on earth. Tracer fire crisscrossed the night sky. Explosions lit the water in eerie flashes of orange and white. The ocean was a sheet of fire. Men shouted orders drowned by the roar of guns. Some ships managed to return fire, but they couldn't see their targets. The Japanese, using their searchlights and superior optics, were deadly accurate. On the USS Quincy, Captain Samuel Moore gave the order to turn toward the enemy, but it was already too late. 3 torpedoes slammed into the ship's side almost simultaneously. One hit near the bridge, killing Moore instantly. Another exploded in the engine room, knocking out power. The ship was burning from bow to stern. Survivors recalled seeing entire gun crews blown into the air by the blasts. Within 20 minutes, Quincy rolled over and sank, taking hundreds of men with her. Nearby, Astoria fought desperately to stay afloat. Her gunners managed to score a few hits on a Japanese cruiser before a shell penetrated her forward magazine. The explosion sent flames shooting 200 feet into the sky. Astoria burned like a torch before finally slipping beneath the waves, and then came the Vincennes. Struck repeatedly by torpedoes and shells, she began listing heavily. Her decks were awash with fire. As she sank, survivors could hear Japanese shells still whistling overhead, striking the sea around them. In less than an hour, 4 Allied cruisers were either sinking or crippled. Over 1,000 men were dead. It was one of the worst defeats in American naval history, second only to Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese victory was not complete. Mikawa, fearing American carrier planes at dawn, decided not to press his attack on the unprotected transports anchored near the shore. If he had, the Marines on Guadalcanal, who still had only a fraction of their supplies unloaded, might have been completely cut off and doomed. Instead, he turned north, leaving behind a sea of burning ships and dying men. By sunrise, the waters around Savo Island were littered with wreckage, floating debris, oil slicks, and hundreds of sailors clinging to life rafts. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning fuel. Rescue operations lasted all morning as destroyers moved slowly among the survivors. Many men were never found. Word of the disaster hit the Allied commanders like a punch to the gut. Admiral Turner was stunned. Admiral Fletcher, already gone with the carriers, received the news hours later. His silence said everything. Admiral King, back in Washington, was furious but cold. "We've been hit hard," he said, "but we'll hit back harder." For the Marines on Guadalcanal, the loss at sea changed everything. With the fleet gone and their supply ships withdrawing, they were now stranded. The 11,000 men on that humid island had only 10 days' worth of rations, limited ammunition, and no promise of reinforcements. They began to dig in, turning the captured airfield into a fortress. They didn't know it yet, but the Japanese weren't done. While American forces scrambled to defend their fragile foothold, the Japanese army was already preparing to retake the island. Troops began landing on the far side of Guadalcanal, disciplined, determined men who believed it was their duty to die rather than retreat. What followed would become one of the most brutal campaigns of World War II, a months-long struggle of mud, blood, and exhaustion. But for now, in those first few days, the Marines worked tirelessly to make Henderson Field operational. Under the blazing sun, bulldozers, captured from the Japanese, cleared the debris, leveled the coral, and rebuilt the runway. They worked around the clock, sleeping in shallow foxholes and swatting at clouds of mosquitoes. By August 20th, the first American aircraft, a group of Marine Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers, landed on the newly completed runway. When the engines roared to life, the men cheered. At last, they had air support of their own. The Cactus Air Force, as it came to be known, was small, under-equipped, and constantly short on fuel. But it was fierce. From that point on, the Japanese could no longer attack the island freely. Every bomber or ship that came within range was met with gunfire and determination. Still, the danger never stopped. Every night, Japanese destroyers, nicknamed the Tokyo Express, raced down the slot to bombard Henderson Field and deliver reinforcements. The Marines called them Washing Machine Charlie when their planes dropped bombs in the dead of night, shaking the earth and shredding nerves. Sleep became a luxury. Hunger became normal. Death became routine, and yet they held. Back in Tokyo, Yamamoto was furious and disheartened. The Battle of Savo Island was a rare triumph, but it had achieved nothing lasting. Guadalcanal was supposed to be a stepping stone to Australia. Now it had become a bleeding wound. The Americans refused to give it up. The Imperial General Staff ordered counterattacks, sending thousands of men to reclaim the island. One by one, those attacks failed. Each battle, Tenarue, Edson's Ridge, Henderson Field, was more desperate than the last. Japanese soldiers charged headlong into machine gun fire, believing honor mattered more than life. The Marines, though exhausted, fought with grim determination. Both sides paid in blood for every inch of jungle. By late 1942, the balance of power in the Pacific had begun to shift. The Americans, once on the defensive, were learning fast, learning how to fight in jungles, how to coordinate air and sea power, how to turn raw recruits into battle-hardened veterans. The Japanese, meanwhile, were slowly bleeding out, their best pilots gone, their fuel dwindling, their momentum lost. Guadalcanal became the graveyard of Japanese ambition. When Yamamoto first dreamed of a short, glorious war that would force America to negotiate, he never imagined this, a grinding, endless battle for a single island, fought by men starving, sweating, and dying under tropical rain. The octopus he once described, stretching its tentacles across the Pacific, was now trapped, strangled by its own reach. For 6 long months, the fight for Guadalcanal dragged on. The skies above the island became a daily battlefield. Ships clashed in the surrounding seas, their wrecks piling up beneath the waves. The area would earn a haunting new name from those who survived: Iron Bottom Sound, for the number of ships and souls resting on its floor. When it finally ended in February 1943, Japan had lost nearly 25,000 men. The United States, though victorious, had lost over 7,000. But the outcome was undeniable. The Japanese Empire would never again go on the offensive in the Pacific. From that point on, they were in retreat, step by step, island by island, until the war's bitter end. And it all began with a single decision: to build an airfield on a lonely island that few had ever heard of. Sometimes history turns not on grand empires or vast armies, but on small places, a strip of coral, a jungle clearing, a name whispered over the radio. Guadalcanal was one of those places. It was where the tide turned, where arrogance met resilience, and where courage became the difference between survival and extinction. If you've made it this far, you've felt what those men lived: fear, hope, sacrifice, and victory against impossible odds. And if you love stories like this, stories that bring history to life and remind us what it really cost, then don't just leave. Take a moment right now. Hit that subscribe button. It's free, it helps this channel grow, and it keeps these forgotten stories alive. And in the comments, tell us from where in the world are you watching? Because history belongs to everyone who remembers it. This was the story of Yamamoto's vision, Japan's gamble, and the island that changed the Pacific forever. The days after the Battle of Savo Island were unlike anything the Marines on Guadalcanal had imagined. They were stranded, cut off, undersupplied, and completely alone. The ships that were supposed to protect them had fled. The men on the beaches could still see the oily smoke rising on the horizon, marking the graves of the cruisers lost at Savo. Their hearts sank with the sun that night. There was no cheering anymore. The thrill of landing on Guadalcanal had vanished. The men dug deep foxholes and built makeshift defenses around the half-finished airfield they now called Henderson Field. They knew that sooner or later the Japanese would come for it. And when they did, it would be a fight to the death. The jungle was a living nightmare, hot, humid, and filled with disease. Mosquitoes swarmed by the thousands. The men's clothes never dried, and every night tropical rain poured from the sky. Dysentery spread fast. Cans of food were rotting in the heat. Some Marines were forced to eat captured Japanese rice or hunt coconuts just to stay alive. They called themselves the Cactus Marines after the operation's code name. Then one night, a low rumble echoed from the sea. It started faintly, like distant thunder, but it grew louder, deeper. The Marines ducked for cover as the horizon lit up with flashes. The Japanese Navy had returned. For the first time since the landings, they opened fire on Henderson Field. The bombardment was relentless. For hours, heavy shells rained down, blasting craters into the runway and setting supply dumps on fire. Men huddled in foxholes, their faces pressed to the mud, praying that the next shell wouldn't find them. When dawn came, the airfield was a smoking ruin. But the Marines got up, wiped off the dirt, and started filling craters. They were determined not to give up. By nightfall, the runway was operational again. That was the spirit of Guadalcanal. A few days later, on August 21st, the Japanese struck with their first ground assault. Around 900 elite soldiers under Colonel Ichiki charged across the Tenaru River, screaming as they ran toward the Marine lines. The Americans were ready. They held their fire until the enemy was close, then unleashed a storm of bullets, grenades, and machine gun fire. The river turned red. By morning, hundreds of Japanese bodies floated downstream. Colonel Ichiki took his own life rather than surrender. The victory at Tenaru lifted morale. But the men knew it was just the beginning. Every night, Japanese destroyers, the Tokyo Express, roared down the slot, bringing more troops and supplies. Every night, American radar picked up faint echoes in the dark, followed by thunderous explosions as the enemy shelled Henderson Field again and again. The Marines called those nights hell on earth. Sleep became impossible. During the day, American planes from Henderson, the ragtag Cactus Air Force, took to the skies. Their pilots fought Japanese bombers and fighters in swirling dogfights above the island. The air was filled with black smoke and the roar of engines. Every victory was hard fought. Planes came back shot full of holes, their pilots bleeding, their wings shredded. But every flight mattered. Every sortie meant one more day they could hold out. Then, in early September, the Japanese launched another massive assault. This time, over 6,000 soldiers under General Kawaguchi attacked the ridges south of Henderson Field. Their plan was to sneak through the jungle and strike the airfield from behind. But the Marines had a man waiting for them, the same Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson who had survived Tulagi. For 3 nights, Edson's raiders and paratroopers defended what would later be called Edson's Ridge. The fighting was savage. The Japanese came in waves, screaming, charging through the dark with bayonets and grenades. The Marines fired until their barrels glowed red, until their guns jammed, until they were down to knives and fists. On the 3rd night, the Japanese broke through the perimeter. They got so close that some Marines could hear their officers shouting commands in Japanese. But Edson refused to retreat. He ran up and down the line, shouting, "Hold what you've got! The only direction we go from here is forward." By dawn, the ridge was carpeted with bodies. Hundreds of Japanese lay dead. Henderson Field was safe. After that, the Marines knew. If they could survive this, they could survive anything. But the Japanese still refused to give up. They brought in fresh troops, artillery, and even tanks. They were determined to take back Guadalcanal at any cost. The Imperial Army believed it was a matter of honor. Losing the island was unthinkable. In October, Yamamoto himself ordered a massive offensive to wipe out the American pests. Battleships shelled the airfield again, shaking the ground like an earthquake. The explosions were so powerful that men said it felt like the island was coming apart. But still, the Marines repaired the runway, again and again. When Japanese bombers returned the next day, they were met by the guns of the Cactus Air Force. Planes took off as shells still fell around them. One pilot later said, "We didn't take off. We were blasted into the air by the shock waves." In those weeks, courage wasn't about charging forward. It was about staying alive, about holding your post when everything around you was on fire. And they did. Then came one of the most decisive nights of the campaign, October 25th, the Battle for Henderson Field. Thousands of Japanese soldiers attacked the American perimeter in a desperate attempt to overrun the airfield once and for all. They charged through the jungle screaming, their rifles and bayonets gleaming in the moonlight. The Marines, now hardened by months of fighting, stood firm. Machine guns rattled, mortars thumped, and tracers lit up the night like fireworks. The air smelled of cordite, blood, and sweat. By morning, the ground was littered with over 3,000 Japanese dead. Henderson Field still stood. It was the breaking point. After that night, the Japanese army began to crumble. Their supply lines were stretched to breaking, their soldiers starving and sick. The American Navy, now regaining strength, cut off Japanese convoys and destroyed ships in brutal night battles off the coast. The sea became a graveyard of steel, earning the haunting name, Iron Bottom Sound. By December, Japanese morale had collapsed. The once proud Imperial troops who had believed they could conquer the Pacific were now trapped on an island they could neither hold nor escape. Disease killed more of them than bullets. Many starved to death in the jungle, too weak to fight. Meanwhile, the Americans were growing stronger. New troops arrived. Fresh ships sailed in. The balance had shifted. When the final evacuation began in early 1943, the Japanese Navy quietly slipped through the darkness, rescuing what few survivors they could. The empire that had once boasted of its invincibility was now running away. When word reached Tokyo that Guadalcanal had been abandoned, there was silence. No speeches, no triumph, no songs. Only the quiet realization that the tide of war had turned, and it would never turn back. For Japan, Guadalcanal was more than a defeat. It was the beginning of the end. For the United States, it was proof that courage, resilience, and teamwork could overcome even the most powerful enemy. It was the moment America stopped retreating and started to win. The island that had once seemed like a forgotten speck in the Pacific had changed the course of the entire war. The men who fought there never forgot it. Many of them were just 18, 19, 20 years old. They faced hunger, fear, and hopeless odds, but they didn't quit. They built an airfield from ruins, held it against everything the enemy threw at them, and proved that the impossible could be done. Even now, if you visit Guadalcanal, You can still see the rusting wrecks beneath the waves, the abandoned foxholes swallowed by jungle, the old airstrip now quiet and still. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The sound of engines, the thunder of guns, the voices of men who refuse to give in. That's what makes this story timeless. It's not just about war, it's about endurance. It's about belief. It's about what people can do when the world tells them they can't. And if you've been with me through this entire journey, from Yamamoto's first doubts to the final retreat of Japan, you've seen how history is shaped not by destiny, but by the choices of individuals. People like Edson, Vandegrift, and the Marines who refused to leave Henderson Field. These were ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, and they changed history forever. So, before you go, take a second and think about what you've just heard. Think about the courage it takes to stand your ground when everything is falling apart. That's not just history, that's humanity. And if stories like this inspire you, if they remind you of what determination and courage really mean, then please, subscribe right now. It's free, it supports the channel, and it helps keep the memory of these heroes alive. Because the more we remember them, the more we understand what it means to fight for something greater than ourselves. Tell me in the comments, from where in the world are you watching this? Let's honor these stories together no matter where we are. Because history isn't just in books and it's in us. It's alive every time we tell it. This was the story of Guadalcanal, the island that broke Japan's ambition and gave birth to America's victory. The war in the Pacific would rage on for 3 more brutal years. But after Guadalcanal, it was never the same again. The island had taken everything from Japan, its best soldiers, its strongest ships, and most importantly, its confidence. The empire that once stretched boldly across the Pacific now began to crumble, one island at a time. When news of the defeat reached Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in silence. He, more than anyone, understood what it meant. The man who had once warned Japan's leaders not to underestimate America now saw his fears come true. His brilliant strike at Pearl Harbor had awakened a giant, and Guadalcanal had proven that the giant would never sleep again. He looked down at the reports, the staggering numbers of dead, the ruined ships, the lost planes. Every page was a reminder of how far Japan had fallen from the euphoria of 1941. The very empire he had helped expand was now bleeding from the inside. Yamamoto's hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. He had predicted this from the start, that Japan could win victories for 6 months, maybe a year, but beyond that, the United States' industrial might would crush them. Guadalcanal had been the beginning of that reality. From that point forward, Japan was no longer advancing. It was surviving. Across the Pacific, the tide began to turn. The United States launched one operation after another: Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima. Each island came at a cost, but with every victory, the path to Japan grew clearer. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal became the blueprint for every invasion that followed: amphibious assaults, coordinated air cover, and sheer determination in the face of overwhelming odds. But Guadalcanal wasn't just a military turning point. It was a human one. For the men who fought there, life would never be the same. They came home with haunted eyes and quiet voices, carrying memories too heavy to share. Some would wake up decades later still hearing the echo of bombardments, still smelling the smoke of Henderson Field. Others never made it home at all, their names carved into stone, their bodies resting somewhere under the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound. And yet, even in all that suffering, there was pride, because Guadalcanal wasn't a story of glory. It was a story of endurance. It was proof that even when you're left alone, surrounded and outnumbered, you can still hold on. You can still fight back. The Japanese soldiers who fought there were no less brave. Many died believing they were defending their emperor, their homeland, their families. They were trapped by a system that demanded victory or death. In a strange, tragic way, both sides on Guadalcanal were victims of ideology, of pride, of war itself. As the months passed and Japan's situation worsened, Yamamoto continued to lead. He still believed in duty, even as he doubted the cause. In April 1943, he made one final inspection tour of the front lines, flying over the Solomon Islands, the same region where Guadalcanal had cost him so much. But American intelligence, having cracked Japanese codes, knew his exact flight plan. On April 18th, a squadron of American P-38 fighters ambushed his aircraft. The man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor, who had dreamed of empire, died when his plane crashed into the jungle. His death was announced in Japan with solemn ceremony. But for many, it symbolized the fading of Japan's power and the end of the illusion that the war could ever be won. Back on Guadalcanal, life slowly returned. The jungle began to reclaim the battlefield. The rusting hulks of ships beneath the waves turned into coral reefs. The craters filled with rainwater. The silence that followed was deafening, but Henderson Field remained. The airstrip that once echoed with gunfire and engines would become a symbol of what America had achieved and what it had cost. It wasn't just an airfield. It was a graveyard, a monument, a testament to willpower. In the years after the war, veterans who returned to Guadalcanal said the island felt different, almost sacred. They walked along the overgrown trails where they once fought and saw in the quiet the ghosts of their past selves. "We were boys," one Marine said softly, "and we came home men." History often remembers great battles for their scale, for their strategy, for the weapons, for the generals. But Guadalcanal was different. It was remembered for its humanity. It showed that courage isn't about charging forward into glory. Sometimes courage is staying where you are, holding your ground, when everything in you says to run, and that's what makes it timeless. The Japanese called it the graveyard of the Imperial Army. The Americans called it Hell's Island. But to those who were there, it was simply Guadalcanal, a name that would forever burn in memory. By the time the war ended in 1945, the world was unrecognizable. Japan lay in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ash. The empire of the rising sun had set. But for many historians, the real beginning of that end wasn't the atomic bomb. It was Guadalcanal. That was where Japan's momentum broke. That was where America learned how to win. And even now, decades later, that story still matters, because it reminds us that the greatest battles are not always fought with guns and bombs. Sometimes they're fought inside, against fear, against doubt, against hopelessness. Guadalcanal was proof that when people refuse to give up, when they dig in and hold the line, they can change the course of history. So as you sit here, maybe on your phone or computer, watching this story unfold, remember, this isn't just about soldiers or ships. It's about resilience. It's about what it means to endure. Imagine being one of those men cut off from the world, hungry, scared, and alone. Imagine knowing that no one is coming to save you, and still standing your ground anyway. That's what they did. And that's why we tell their story. Because in a world that often feels uncertain, remembering what real courage looks like matters more than ever. And if you felt something while hearing this, if you learned something, or if you were inspired by the determination of those who fought, for every inch of that island, then do one thing for them: subscribe. Not just because it helps the channel, though it truly does, but because every subscription means one more person who remembers, one more person who keeps history alive, one more voice saying, "These stories matter." Hit that button, drop a comment, and tell us from where in the world you're watching. Whether you're in the US, Germany, India, the Philippines, or anywhere else, history belongs to you too. Together, we can make sure that the sacrifices on that tiny island in the Pacific are never forgotten. Because in the end, Guadalcanal wasn't just the turning point of a war. It was the turning point of courage, of will, of humanity itself. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, the human spirit, like the faint glow of a ship's lantern on Iron Bottom Sound, can still light the way.